Cape Breton Island is a tough place to grow up. But those who leave often long to return. It's a joy to see familiar faces and familiar places. But there's a reason people say you can't go home again. Sometimes, going home is murder. In true crime, investigation and conviction may take years. But every detective knows that the crucial clue is always there, somewhere in the first 72 hours. Cape Breton police respond to a 911 call. There is an emergency at Big Ben's convenience store.
I approached the store, myself and another young constable. I announced myself, city police, anybody here? And I could see down at the rear of the store this victim laying on the floor in a large pool of blood. She was covered in blood. She had large lacerations on the top of her head. Her throat area was a large gash. Miraculously, she was still living.
But the paramedics can't save her. Cape Breton police are now dealing with a homicide.
When I arrived at the scene, it was a horrific scene. There was blood everywhere. The scene was a mess, and it looked like it was going to be just a difficult file to investigate.
Detective Doyle instructs the forensic team to collect evidence for DNA analysis.
They discovered a number of exhibits, such as styrofoam cups and cigarette butts. We assumed that the murder weapon was an edged weapon of some kind. We had no idea where it was.
The store owner arrives and tells police the victim's name is Marie Dupay. Just last week, Marie was hired as a clerk. Tonight was her first time working the night shift alone. Detective Doyle asked the owner to check the cash register.
And when he did the cash balance, there was an amount of money missing, around $500.
But the extreme violence suggests more than a simple robbery.
The injuries that she sustained were the worst I've ever seen, and hopefully I'll never see it again.
There was a certain amount of rage that took place. It appeared to be a very angry person who did this.
Detectives wonder whether Marie Dupay knew her attacker. Early the following morning, police call on Marie's husband, Douglas Dupay.
Told the victim's husband that indeed your wife had passed away overnight, and his response was she murdered?
His response raises suspicion. Why would Dupay assume his wife was murdered? The investigators learn the couple have only been living in Cape Breton for 2 months.
The victim and her husband had worked many years in Ontario, former Cape Bretoners. They wanted to return home to Sydney to a quiet life.
Dupay then reveals that he was upset with Marie for wanting to go back to work.
He didn't want her to take this job. He didn't want her working at this store. She didn't really need to work.
When police asked Dupay where he was last night, he says he was home alone. He insists he had nothing to do with his wife's death. Investigators release information to the media, hoping an eyewitness will come forward.
And the first thing that happens, especially in a small town like Sydney, is that the rumor mill begins to grind.
Rumors like the murderer is someone from away.
We would get tips, anonymous tips. Numerous people would call us and ask us, have we checked the husband?
72 hours into the investigation, police give Douglas Dupay a polygraph. When Dupay denies he killed his wife, the test says he's lying.
We interviewed friends of both him and his wife, to try and find out what kind of relationship they did have.
Everyone tells police the same story.
They were very close. They did everything together. They appeared to have a very loving relationship.
Now convinced the couple had a good marriage, detectives asked Dupay about his emotional state during the polygraph. Dupay says he must have failed because he was taking medication to dull his grief. The detectives eliminate Dupay from the investigation, but the ordeal has taken its toll.
It must have been just devastating for him. When you find out that your worst fears have just come true, and then to almost immediately become a suspect in this matter, and it must have been just horrible for him to go through that.
There have been 11 murders in Cape Breton this year, but none as brutal as this one.
The citizens of Sydney were very fearful. There was a sense around Sydney that this guy could attack again. Horrific crime like that stirs emotions. People want to help.
Two young women come forward. On the night of the murder, they visited Big Ben's at 2 a.m.
They had been out for the evening. They had come into the store to get some snacks. They observed a young gentleman in the store who was, in their terminology, suspicious. He was having a coffee, smoking a cigarette at the lunch counter. They spoke to the convenience store clerk, who expressed that she was kind of nervous of this young guy.
Neither witness can recall having seen the man before. Neither got a good look at his face. They fail to provide a detailed description. At the crime lab, technicians analyze DNA from the murder scene. All samples match individuals who have been eliminated from the investigation, all except for one cigarette butt.
And that DNA came back as an unknown male profile.
Police believe the killer may be this unknown male. The problem is, they have no idea what he looks like or where to find him. Marie Dupay and her husband returned home to Cape Breton to find a quiet life. But less than 2 months after her arrival, police are investigating her murder. Investigators re-interview their two witnesses using a new approach.
These two individuals went under hypnosis, and statements were taken from them. During hypnosis, we hired a local artist. He sat, listened to the descriptions. He was able to come up with this composite that matched the suspect. It was the first time that we really had a look at the assailant.
When the drawing appears in the local paper, hundreds of tips flood in. Every tip is checked. Every tip leads nowhere, except for one.
We received information from a young couple that a friend of theirs was actually saying things that he was involved in this robbery homicide.
The informants say their friend's name is Brian Donovan. Since the night Brian bragged about the murder, they haven't seen him around.
And the person fit the profile of the suspect we were looking for. As a matter of fact, this particular gentleman ended up calling me.
Doyle keeps Donovan on the line while the call is traced across the country to a phone booth in Vancouver. Donovan says his father phoned to say the police were looking for him. He wants to know why.
And I told him at the time, well, like, I don't have the file in front of me. Why don't you give me a chance to tomorrow get the file? And I said, you call me from that phone booth tomorrow evening, we'll go over the file. We headed out to British Columbia just as fast as we could. When he arrived at that phone booth the next evening, I was there waiting for him with the Vancouver police.
Donovan insists his friends are lying. He never said he killed anyone. He claims he left Sydney several days before the murder.
He told us his route coming across Canada and the different places he stayed at. He was getting mixed up. Nobody else seemed to remember him.
Doyle calls a Toronto hostel where Donovan claims he stayed.
When we described him and said his name, they had him staying at the hostel on the 22nd, which was the date of the murder. So he was eliminated as a suspect.
Cape Breton police have never had an unsolved homicide. They're concerned this may be their first. 10 years pass, but nobody forgets about the murder of Marie Dupé.
The case was cold, but the case was never cold in our minds. I don't think there was a week went by that I didn't somehow think about the Big Ben's homicide.
We are a small community here in Cape Breton, and that type of violent crime would affect anybody, but in our community where we're not experienced with that stuff, it affects us more. People want this thing solved.
Police finally get a lead when a local man turns up at the police station. He says he was in the Big Ben store on the night of the murder, but that's not all.
This individual eventually turned to one of our investigators and he said, I did it.
The confession comes from a man named Ian Taylor. Police know him because his twin sister was recently murdered.
The strength of his statement, he was arrested, and he was remanded to jail.
But to keep him in jail, detectives need more than a confession.
That's all we had. It was his words. And that certainly is not enough to go forward in court. So we went the scientific route.
A sample of Taylor's DNA is compared to the unmatched sample found at the murder scene. It is not a match.
It was proven that he was not in the scene. He was not linked to any of the evidence that we had at the scene.
So why did Taylor confess to a murder he didn't commit?
He told us that he just wanted to go to prison to try to get the guy who killed his sister.
The charge against Ian Taylor is dropped. Once again, police have no suspects. All they have is a composite sketch and DNA from a cigarette that may belong to the killer of Marie Dupé. But in a city halfway across the country, an unrelated crime is about to point investigators in an entirely new direction. After a brutal murder in a convenience store, a 10-year investigation has uncovered few clues as to the identity of the killer. But that's about to change when Toronto police investigating an assault send the suspect's DNA to the National Data Bank.
The DNA data bank had what was known as a hit. One piece of our evidence matched a profile that they had on file.
DNA from the cigarette found at the murder scene matches a man named Ernest Gordon Strobridge.
The big thing is, okay, what have we got here? That was the question. We had a cigarette butt, and that would put him in the scene. We had to get much more than just that cigarette butt to get a conviction on this guy in court. We felt that the only person who may have that information was Ernest Gordon Strobridge himself.
Mr. Strobridge now became our #1 target.
Cape Breton police travel to Ontario. They arrest Strobridge on an outstanding warrant as part of an elaborate plan to get him to confess.
He was arrested by the Mississauga police, was transported to Kingston, Ontario.
The operational plan was, of course, to introduce Strobridge to an undercover police officer. That officer's job was to gain confidence, the confidence of Strobridge.
The undercover officer pretends to be a criminal with underworld connections. He invites Strobridge to give him a call when he gets out of jail. A few weeks later, Strobridge does exactly that.
He was involved in a number of stage criminal events. We had staged drug buys, break-and-enters, stealing trucks, a number of different scenarios that would encourage Strobridge to join our organization.
Eventually, the undercover officer believes he has Strobridge's trust.
He said he's ready. If he's going to confess it, if he's going to give it up, he'll give it up.
The officer takes Strobridge to meet the boss of the organization, Mr. Big.
The undercover officer introduced him. The boss basically told the other undercover officer, "You can leave now, I want to talk to Gord alone."
Strobridge doesn't know it, but the investigative team is watching and listening to every word he says.
I have to trust you. You've been involved with my guy for a number of weeks now, so you know some things about us. I don't know anything about you. So he just asked him to tell him about his past.
Turns out, when it comes to his past, Strobridge is not shy.
He had a very, very tough upbringing. He was from Newfoundland. He ended up being on his own very early. He seemed to be somebody that had prepared for this interview. He knew what he wanted to say, and he was trying to make himself sound really good.
He tells Mr. Big that one night, 10 years before, he ended up in a convenience store in Cape Breton. He was drunk, he was stoned. He had nowhere else to go. Later that night, 2 girls came into the store. When the old lady told them she was afraid of the stranger, he overheard. After the girls left, the lady asked him to leave. He refused.
She motioned with her hand, and in her hand was a knife that she was doing work with.
He was highly intoxicated at the time. You know, he felt that she had maybe threatened him. He had a lot of problems in life, and I think everything just came together right there and then, and he just lost it.
After his rage was spent, Strobridge emptied the till and made his escape. Strobridge says he's never told anyone about that night, until now. A cigarette collected during the first 72 hours of the investigation proves Strobridge was at the murder scene. His own words, caught on tape, prove he's the killer. When they make their arrest, Strobridge can't believe it.
The officers actually had to hold him up. He was completely in shock. He was a complete mess. He just completely broke down.
I don't think his emotions were really true emotions. The only time he became emotional was after he realized that the jig was up.
Ernest Strobridge is charged with murder in the second degree. He is convicted and sentenced to life in prison for a moment of rage that wrenched a wife from her husband and scarred an island forever.
The community of Cape Breton, they can sleep well now that this case has been solved, and we hope to God that we'll never have another one like it.
The stories on 72 Hours are true. The detectives and forensic scientists are the ones who actually worked on the case.